Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and my ideas recently about the podcast has been to intersperse interesting topics about growing plants with more sort of dry topics about chemistry or lighting and things like this, and problems and challenges. So today we did nitrogen yesterday, which was a bit dry. So today I thought I'd do a really interesting subject about growing Chinese yams, which is one of my interests. I have been around the world to Japan to study Chinese yams, not to China. Why go to Japan to study Chinese yams? Well, that's because we call them Chinese yams, but they don't call them Chinese yams over there, and they consider them to be just as much Japanese as they are Chinese. And actually they grow more Chinese yams, I think, in Japan. It's more of a delicacy, and there's lots of interesting stories about it. So I went to Japan about the year after the Fukushima nuclear reactor went into meltdown, I want to say. Certainly very, very critical. It's like one of the fourth biggest nuclear accidents, or top three nuclear accidents in the world ever, along with, 3 Mile Island and obviously Chernobyl. And that was caused by the tsunami. And Chinese yams were being used then as an alternative to seaweed, because they are, when you cut them up and use them, they are full of like a gel-like substance, carbohydrates. And so they could make fake seaweed using Chinese yams. And why would you want fake seaweed? Well, if the seaweed is contaminated with radioisotopes, you don't want to be eating seaweed from the Fukushima area. So I went to Japan to study Chinese yams. I've been to Japan to study Asarum, the plant that is pollinated by slugs and snails. I've talked about that in a previous podcast, I'm sure. But I've been to Japan to study LED lighting, and I went to study Chinese yams. I got a grant from the Farmers Club of London. Yep, so the prestigious club in London, and I went off to study them, and they grow in one specific region of Japan, and they grow as a vine, and they look a bit like a potato, and but they grow as a vine, so you have to grow them, and they grow much deeper into the ground than a potato, so you actually have to dig down to get them. That's one of the disadvantages. Although if you were growing in areas where potatoes were being stolen, then you could grow Chinese yams because no one would know where the crop is. And the other disadvantage is that you have to put back 30 to 40% of the actual material you harvest for propagation the next year. It's a strange plant. It's a monocot, whereas most tuber crops like potatoes are dicots, like, when we think of tomatoes, cucumbers, rather than monocots, which are like grasses and maize and reeds. So it's a strange one that it's a monocot. Has parallel veins on its leaves, and it produces bulbils on the leaves as well, which you can use for propagation. You don't want them to flower. I think most of the ones that are grown are male. So it's a dioecious species, but it's one where you grow the male rather than the female, which is interesting. And unlike the yams that come from African or Caribbean culture, this one you can eat before you cook it. It doesn't need cooking to remove any toxic residues, which is very interesting because obviously reduces processing and energy inputs, and means it can be used fresh and in different recipes. It's not used much in the UK, although it should be, because it's a really interesting plant. I've got some in my garden. My wife hates it because it gets in amongst all her plants where she wants to grow. But I like the fact that Chinese yams come up every year, very, very late to emerge, sort of like late May. And that's one of the other disadvantages of growing Chinese yams. So could they be used hydroponically to get them growing faster and more all year round production? I think that's a really interesting subject. What else can we say? So there are lots of yams. There's water yams, purple yams, big, large African yams. I used to when I went to the farmers club, I said that the best thing about Leicester, where I used to live, is the market and all the different cultures you get at the market. And I used to go to this guy he's called Michael, and he had an Afro-Caribbean shop, and I used to go and I used to get all the different types of yams. And I would say, "You got any water yams, Michael?" And he would say, "No, not this week, Russell." And every week, "No, not this week." And then I'd point at a strange vegetable, and I'd go, "What's that, Michael?" And all these like Caribbean women would be stood around laughing. And he'd go, "You don't know what this is, man. Your mama never used to cook this for you." And I was like, "F off, Michael. What the fuck? flipping heck is it? And then he'd say in like a Leicester accent, oh, it's just this and this and this. I was like, oh, thank you very much for making an absolute fool of me in front of all these old ladies. So I really like studying yams, if you haven't worked that out. It's got a few, interestingly, they've got a few scientific names for Chinese yam, and they're not quite sure what the actual species is. Dioscorea polystachya, but oppositifolia is another one I've heard. So it's not really been pinned down, the taxonomy of this species. It is, I think it's prone to viruses because it's a perennial crop. It's native to East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and it's obviously used in all those areas because it grows so deep in the ground and emerges so late. It's really hardy, so it can grow USDA hardiness zones, if you know what they are, 4 to 9. Grows with heart-shaped leaves, scented flowers. I've never smelt the flowers though, so I don't know about that. And it's the edible underground tubers you're after. The leaves and the yams themselves of many of the species in the yam genus are full of steroid chemicals, natural plant steroids. And I think certain species in Africa are used to make female contraceptives. And it's said that Jamaican runners are so fast because of the natural steroids that are in yams. However, it's also known that Usain Bolt doesn't like yams and never eats yams. So is he the exception that proves the rule? Or it certainly can't be due to that. So, and yeah, convenient one that, isn't it? The tubers can reach 1 meter in depth, so you're going to need a really sandy soil for this. You can't be digging up clay to 1 meter. They can weigh several kilos though when they're harvested, and it's that starchy, stable crop in East Asia. Adds texture similar to new potatoes, so really, really valuable potatoes, new potatoes. They're perennial and low import. Once established, they regrow every year like asparagus or rhubarb, but the harvest is not great. Aerial bulbils, you can't eat the bulbils, they'll be poisonous. They're edible raw though, that's the main advantage. So you can plant the small tubers or the aerial tubers. They need full sun or partial shade. They grow on A-framed supports, vertical supports, netting, poles, trellises, up to 3 to 6 meters. That is pretty tall. These plants grow really tall, and they can strangle other foliage if you're not careful. So if you grow them hydroponically, you could have a lattice system, sort of like scrog nets, to control these. They don't have to go vertically. They could go horizontally, but they are going to grow as a vine. And I don't know anyone who's grown them hydroponically. So could you grow them hydroponically? Who knows? I think this is as I say, this is one I would really look at, especially if you're growing in hydroponics in like a greenhouse that gets frosty in the winter and you can't heat it. And this could be a good one for a perennial crop. As I say, can be invasive, so just be careful of that if you are growing it in the soil. Another reason to grow hydroponically, really, I suppose. And I'd say it's a bit like speak to a local Afro-Caribbean or Asian importer, see if they'd be interested in growing, growing Chinese yams hydroponically, and whether there's an advantage of having them fresh rather than being imported. A bit like I talked about the other day about the peonies. Go to these people and speak to them and see what is their pain points. Do they struggle to get Chinese yams? Is freshness an issue? Do they struggle to get certain fruit and veg at certain times of year? That's how you'll make your money in hydroponics. Not thinking, oh, I really want to grow this plant. Is there a market for it? Like I did with samphire. I thought, I can grow samphire. I've got these 3 different techniques I can use to grow samphire. I'm going to grow samphire and see if I can sell it. And nobody wanted it. There was no pain point there. They were more than happy to keep on buying Israeli samphire that if you look on the Waitrose or Marks and Spencer's supermarket website, people complain that it sticks and it's horrible. So yeah, they were more than happy to carry on buying that. So yeah, work out where the pain points are and go from there. But it could be a really interesting hydroponic crop. Being a monocot, you want to make sure that there's ample levels of silicon and just have a look at make sure the pH doesn't go crazy. Who knows what the pH and optimum EC levels are? No one's looked at it. No one's looked at hydroponic Chinese yams yet, to my knowledge. So it's a blue ocean. The big issue will be making sure that the yam tuber can produce in the grow media that you're using. So probably not one for rock wool, but maybe one for like clay beads or volcanic particles. something that a tuber can develop into. And if you gave it long days all day, all the time, maybe it won't go dormant and you could have a continuous crop. That would be the dream, wouldn't it? So that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Could we potentially be growing Chinese yams in hydroponics? Who knows? I have no idea. I'd love to try it. If you'd love to collaborate on a project with me growing Chinese yams, then get in touch with me and I'll happily provide you with some Chinese yams and some fertilizer, or we can get going. You provide the hydroponic system and we'll do it. All right. Until tomorrow, that's been Hydroponics Daily. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.